One of the biggest must-win games for South Carolina's football program in 2024. We'll discuss not one, not two, but three of them on this edition of Locked On Gamecocks.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also the lead publisher for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Happy Friday, everybody. Hope that y'all have had a fantastic week up until this point. We don't have a lot that we're going to discuss on this show in terms of varying topics, but we do have one big question that we're going to try to answer that is going to take up all of the time on today's show. And that question is this: what are the biggest must-win games for Shane Beamer and South Carolina's football program heading into the 2024 season? So let's go ahead and start off with the biggest must-win game for the Gamecocks. And this one is one I think that's going to surprise a few of you. The game that I've selected for this slot is the Texas A&M game that's going to take place in Week 10. Now, the first reason why I have the Texas A&M game listed as the biggest must-win game for South Carolina in the 2024 season is because of the likely implications that will be riding on this matchup. This is the first game for South Carolina coming out of what I've just deemed the gauntlet for the 2024 season. And the gauntlet basically being 3 games against Ole Miss at home, then at Alabama, and then at Oklahoma. If we're being realistic here, the Gamecocks are probably losing at least 2 of those games and potentially even all of them. Now, you could make the argument that maybe they could win one of those 3 games, and I could probably be persuaded. But with how brutal of a slate that's going to be, we all know, having watched SEC football for a long time now, it's not just one singular game that gets you. It is the cumulative attrition, the accumulated fatigue after playing so many tough opponents in a row. That's what really starts to wear on a football team. And with the fan base and administration both expecting Shane Beamer and the team to bounce back to a certain degree this season, this is a game that, in all honesty, you really cannot afford to drop. Now, the second reason why I think this is the biggest must-win game for Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks is the timing of when this game is taking place. Because while, yes, you've got those brutal games against the Rebels, Crimson Tide, and Sooners before this matchup even takes place, you do get a bye week before this game. And you also play the Vanderbilt Commodores the following week. So from a schedule dynamic perspective, this sets up nicely for Shane Beamer and this football team to pay a little bit more attention to the Aggies. You're going to already get the embedded extra time to do so with the bye week. And let's be honest, Vanderbilt, they're the worst team in the SEC. You haven't lost to them since 2008. And the coaching staff, although they're going to go up to these microphones and they're going to say, we're going to take Vanderbilt as seriously as we would maybe a Georgia or Alabama, y'all, come on now. Let's be honest. South Carolina's not going to have to do that much game planning in order to get ready for Vanderbilt. And the players, let's also be honest, are probably not going to be looking at Vanderbilt as a very serious opponent. They're going to probably put all of their concentration, all of their focus on Texas A&M for that entire week, and obviously have no reason, again, to think ahead about the Commodores the following weekend. So you should have ample time to prepare for this game, both of what you got going on the front end and on the back end of that week. And then the last reason why I think that this is the biggest must-win game for Shane Beamer in South Carolina, that being the Texas A&M game, is what the optics would look like if you lost this game. Texas A&M, obviously a lot of change taking place over there. They have a new head coach now in Mike Elko. He'll be a first-year SEC head coach in 2024. But Mike Elko is not new to this, admittedly. Mike Elko, of course, used to be the defensive coordinator at Texas A&M. Don't know how long exactly he was there, but through the latter part of the previous decade and early part of this decade, he was at Texas A&M under Jimbo Fisher, their previous head coach, ironically enough. And then he took the head coaching job at Duke, and all he's done is make Duke a relevant football program again in the ACC over the past 2 years. Not a whole lot of coaches can say that they have done that. So Mike Elko clearly seems like that at least he has a pretty good idea of what he's doing so far in his head coaching career. And I say all that to say this, even though Mike Elko is not your prototypical first-year SEC head coach where you got a ton of question marks about what he could possibly do, if Shane Beamer were to lose this game, all the fan base is going to say, outside the reasons why they lost, all they're going to want to talk about more than likely is how, wow, Mike Elko is literally in his first year in College Station, and he comes into our home stadium and beats us. Boosters will think the same thing. Boosters, in a lot of ways, are just like the fans. They just happen to have a whole lot of money, and so they get some special privileges, obviously, that come along with that. So needless to say, if up to this point in the season, the year has not gone the way that Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks would have liked, maybe they don't beat Kentucky or LSU at the beginning of the season. Let's say that gauntlet against Ole Miss, Alabama, and Oklahoma, it just goes worst case scenario. You go 0 for 3. That's already 5 losses right there. So if you then turn around after having extra time to get ready, having this game in your own home stadium, if you lose this game against a first-year head coach in the SEC in Mike Elko and the Texas A&M Aggies, that's going to be a really bad look on Shane Beamer. And if the season has already gone off the rails at that point, and that's your 6th loss, it's going to get really, really loud in Columbia. So, for all of the reasons that I just listed, this is by far and away the biggest must-win game for South Carolina and Shane Beamer, especially here in 2024. But as I mentioned earlier, we're not just going over that one. We got 2 more that we're going to discuss on today's show, and we're going to get into the second one here in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is the formula for winning championships, and also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to this early Friday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen, wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, or your first watch on YouTube. Now, the biggest must-win game for the South Carolina Gamecocks in 2024 is without a doubt the Texas A&M game in my mind. But what's the second biggest must-win game? In my opinion, that game is their Week 2 matchup at Kentucky. Now, just like Texas A&M game, a few different things that I'm thinking about here when I list Kentucky here at number 2. The first thing I want to bring up is obviously this game is going to be a huge momentum boost for whoever comes out on top. So, South Carolina, look, they're playing Old Dominion in Week 1. I think it's fair to say the Gamecocks are going to win that game. If they don't win that game, they've got a whole lot of other problems to deal with outside this game against Kentucky. But they should be 1-0 coming into that game. Assume that Kentucky's going to have the same record. And whoever wins that game, they're going to be 2-0 and have an early 1-0 record in SEC play because this is the first SEC game of the football calendar here in college football in 2024. And the other thing is this, South Carolina, they don't get a whole lot of time to catch their breath after this game because they have to turn around and play the LSU Tigers in week 3 at home, a game that even though it's at home, they're probably going to be an underdog in according to the odds makers at FanDuel and everybody else, obviously. So for South Carolina, if you want to try to ensure that you get something out of these, I would say, early difficult games on your schedule, then the Kentucky game is probably the game to get here because you've won 2 years in a row against Kentucky, and Kentucky obviously does not have the most imposing home field environment in all college football, much less the SEC. And by the way, we now know this game is kicking off at 3:30 Eastern time, which means that local time, it's actually kicking off at 2:30 in Lexington, Kentucky. So obviously, Kentucky fans probably upset about that. South Carolina fans, you got to feel a little bit better about that because it's still going to be middle of the day, so it's not like, the team's got to get up early and immediately get over there. But at the same time, Wildcat fans can't get all liquored up in preparation for that game. Maybe I'm underestimating them a little bit because obviously bourbon and whiskey is a big deal up there in Kentucky, but nonetheless, I think it'll have a much less impact with it being a 2:30 kick instead of a 6:30 kick or 7 o'clock kick. Now, the next reason why I think that Kentucky is the second biggest must-win game for South Carolina in 2024 is the fact that both coaches and programs are viewed in a very similar light. When you look at both of these teams and what they did last year, they both had underwhelming seasons based on their expectation levels. South Carolina obviously went 5-7, missed out on a bowl game. Gamecock fans were not expecting that to happen, especially with having a guy like Spencer Rattler at quarterback. I'll get to that in just a moment. Kentucky, they went 7-6 overall. So yes, they did make it to a bowl game while South Carolina didn't, but that was the same record that they had the previous year, and they had just added Devin Leary from NC State, Ray Davis from Vanderbilt. They added some really good portal players and looked like they had maybe one of the best groups of skill players, offensively speaking, in the SEC East and maybe even the entire SEC. But they didn't really do a whole lot with that, and that included them blowing their bowl game against the Clemson Tigers, which obviously just gives Gamecock fans another reason to dislike Kentucky even more. But getting back to what I said about Spencer Rattler just a moment ago, Shaper and Mark Stoops, both of these coaches, let's be honest, they both had future NFL quarterbacks on their roster, in some cases, for 2-3 years. Obviously, Will Levis at Kentucky in 2021 and 2022, and then Spencer Rattler for South Carolina the last 2 years. Rattler obviously had to deal with Marcus Satterfield in 2022, and let's be frank, he didn't have enough help around him in 2023. With Kentucky and Will Levis, he had a good situation in 2021. Good players around him, a really good play caller, Liam Cohen, and that seemed to really help him out a good amount. 2022, however, Liam Cohen goes on to the NFL. A guy from the NFL, Rich Scangarello, I want to say, he comes to Kentucky, and it just was not the same. The O-line also had some pretty big losses as well that Kentucky kind of glossed over, I would say, from a fan base standpoint, and it wound up being kind of a disaster. So in both of those instances, these head coaches had high-level future NFL quarterbacks at their starting quarterback position, and they did not really get the most out of it. So that's only added to the pressure, the criticism that Shane Beamer and Mark Stoops have gotten over the past year or two. So both of these coaches are going to come into this game really feeling like they have got to have this game. I would say this game, just by a little bit, is probably a bit bigger for Mark Stoops compared to a Shane Beamer, but still, it's a big deal considering how the rest of the league looks at both these teams and kind of view them in a very similar tone. So if you're South Carolina, you want to win once again, keep Kentucky below you, stay ahead of them while trying to get back on your feet at the same time. The last reason why This is the second biggest must-win game for the Gamecocks in 2024. This goes back to Shane Beamer. There are a couple narratives that have circulated around the fan base about Shane Beamer, but there's one that has not been talked about as much that probably should get discussed more, especially now that we're heading into his fourth season as South Carolina's head coach. Shane Beamer has not been a very good road coach in SEC play at this point in his tenure. As a matter of fact, in 12 SEC road games, Shane Beamer currently at South Carolina is 2-10. Awful. The only wins that he has out of those 12 are against Vanderbilt and, ironically enough, Kentucky. Both of those wins came in 2022. So he didn't win a single road game in the conference play in 2021 and did not win a single road game in conference play in 2023. And I get it. That's including games at Tennessee and at Georgia, and considering the home field environments that those two programs have, it's a little bit unfair, kind of cards stacked against you sort of deal compared to other teams in this conference. I would agree with you on that, but the point is, he couldn't control that. No one can control that, and obviously things changed this year. So Shane Beamer has got to flip this narrative of how he is as a coach in SEC road games. You cannot continue to lose at that rate in your fourth season. If you are, then again, fans are going to wonder if there's ever going to be progression in certain areas like that particular aspect right there. So, Texas A&M, the biggest must-win game. Kentucky's the second biggest must-win game. Who is number 3? We'll discuss that team in a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is now an authorized ticket place of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier than before. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. And you can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for games at the ballpark. The Atlanta Braves haven't had great luck against West Coast teams to this point in the season, but they've got a chance to get back against one of those clubs this weekend when they take on the San Diego Padres. And on Sunday, their game's taking place at 7:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. They're going to give swim goggles out to the first 3,000 kids that are in attendance at the ballpark. Tickets right now going for as low as $11. So if you're a dad looking to take your kid to a game and maybe get some free souvenirs along the way, that's the game for you to go to. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms to apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to this edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in 30 minutes or less. All right, let's talk about the third biggest must-win game of the 2024 season for the South Carolina Gamecocks. And this one, I'll be honest, it was an easy one. It's the Palmetto Bowl against the Clemson Tigers on the road this time in Week 14. Not Week 12 or 13, now Week 14 because of the 2 bye weeks embedded in the regular season. First reason, it's pretty obvious. This is the rivalry for South Carolina, for the entire school. And obviously, it involves state bragging rights. It's one of the most unique rivalries in all of college sports because it is an in-state matchup. I think that there's something a bit more special about in-state games compared to, say, cross-border matchups like a Georgia-Florida. I think that this one has a little bit more intensity with it when you're talking about people within the same state borders. So that's the first reason. You all probably would have listed that off first and foremost. Now, the second reason is this. While South Carolina definitely took a step back in 2023, and there's no doubt about that, Clemson hasn't exactly been improving on their side of things. They won only, and I say only, 9 games in 2023. But I say it that way because it's the first time that the Tigers have not won double-digit games in a season since 2010 when they went 6-7. And yes, Clemson did win last year's game 16-7 in Williams-Brice Stadium. And because of the way the game played out, South Carolina's offensive line, let's be honest, they were completely outmatched from the opening snap. Spencer Rattler made a couple of boneheaded mistakes early in this game. And Xavier Legette got a bit banged up because of a low hit that he took, which I thought was a fair, tackle attempt in all honesty. But, he was so banged up at that point in the season, and he had no help at wide receiver, let's just be honest, that it was tough for South Carolina's offense to really get the ball moving at all. And so it felt like the Gamecock fans, the game wasn't close. But in all honesty, it wasn't a blowout either. I mean, Clemson's offense, look, until the last couple drives when South Carolina's defense was just starting to kind of get a little bit more winded and was probably at that point out of gas, they weren't really doing a whole lot on their end either. Cade Klubnik, look, I don't think he's a very impressive quarterback. I think that all the hype that he got for the Heisman Trophy before last season, clearly it all just face planted. Like Cade Klubnik, he's not going to take Clemson to the levels that they reached with a Deshaun Watson or a Trevor Lawrence. He ain't that caliber of a quarterback. He just isn't. My point here is this. Clemson, they got bragging rights, sure, but they're not above and beyond South Carolina like they once used to be. That's not the case anymore. So that's the second reason. Last thing I want to say here. Again, this is going back to worst case scenario mode for Shane Beamer. If things go south, let's say all of the toss-up games to this point in the season. So when I say toss-ups, I'm talking Kentucky, I'm talking LSU, I'm throwing in Ole Miss, maybe Missouri, Texas A&M, and obviously all the really difficult games as well, at Oklahoma, at Alabama. If he loses all of those games, he comes into this matchup at 4-7. He has to find a way to win this game in order to have some good grace with the fans, with the administration, leaving the season. That would mean South Carolina finishes the year 5-7, and I know that fans would absolutely hate it if that happens again. And let's be honest, if South Carolina goes 5-7 for the second year in a row, there are going to be a lot of players that probably leave, because this is no longer an era where you can have multiple down years in a row, especially at South Carolina, and just sit there and convince these kids, yeah, you got no reason to leave. Just stay here and stick it out. No, these kids don't have to stay and stick it out anymore. If they've got questions about how you're running the program and the trajectory of the program, they are completely free to just get up and go find another school to play for. That's the way the sport is now. And in a way, I don't think it's completely bad, because obviously, one, for players, I like the fact that they've got more freedom to do what they want to do. But secondly, it's going to hold these coaches more accountable, okay? You can't sit there and feed them the same, minutia of rhetoric 2, 3 years, 4 years in a row to try to keep them there. So, for Shane Beamer, my whole point with saying all that is, if you have an awful season, if you're 4-7 going into the final week of the regular season, then look, you want to probably guarantee you at least come back one more year. Simple. Beat Clemson. That's it. South Carolina fans will at least take that if you go 5-7 in 2024. With that being said, that's going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show. As always, what games do you think are the biggest must-win games for South Carolina in 2024? Do you think Texas A&M, Kentucky, or Clemson belong on the list? Or are there some other games that you would have included? No matter what your thoughts are, let me know down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @A_SC. But as always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Friday and a fantastic weekend. And I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.